This is a presentation about a qualitative analysis that I did on constructions of problematic substance use by parents whose lives were impacted with problematic substance use. My name is Samantha Magnus. I'm in the Masters of Public Health program at the University of Victoria, and I'm also a research associate here at the Centre for Addictions Research of BC, which I would like to acknowledge is on the territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples. Now, this study actually follows a similar study which looked at the constructions of service providers, some of them involved with harm reduction efforts, on the same question of how to define problematic substance use. I'm going to spend a little bit of time framing substance use around the pregnancy and perinatal period and how that tends to be viewed in the mainstream and in media, as well as some of the evidence before I get into the details of the findings of this particular study. First off, speaking of alcohol specifically, and these are statistics from the BC Centre of Excellence for Women's Health, alcohol-exposed pregnancies are relatively common, and it's because most women tend to drink, and about 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. So just to throw that out there. But when it comes to the effects, women with low socioeconomic status are really hit disproportionately hard, and their children end up suffering more. A few statistics: there was a study in '87 that found that even if a mother was drinking the same amount, if she was in a lower income bracket, then her chances of having a child with fetal alcohol syndrome were higher. A study in Seattle that looked at mothers of children with fetal alcohol syndrome found that nearly 80% of them were quite low income. And Abel and Hannigan point out in their study that regardless of substance use, mothers with low income, their children often will have, on average, lower birth outcomes, poorer birth outcomes, including attention deficit disorder. So think about that when we're talking about the effects of substance use on infants, that socioeconomic status is a bigger factor. Looking at this campaign from the UK, that's not usually what is represented in the media. And the campaigns to discourage women from using substances during pregnancy, and particularly alcohol, will often take this type of approach, which is really meant to make us feel disgusted. It's a shocking approach. The following slide, this is an ad campaign in Nunavut, and the subtitle says, "Pregnant women should never drink alcohol," and the tone there is really threatening. And this is a recent campaign just from this year. The other approach these sometimes take, this slide looks really lovely. The image is more palatable than the previous two that we've seen. And this is a current campaign in Ontario. The subtitle says, "For the love of children, don't drink while pregnant." And the understanding there, the more subtler message, is that if you do drink, you don't love your children. Which personally, I think hearing this message, if I was struggling with substance use and a parent, I can imagine this sort of message would just make me want to drink more. And that's a common critique of these shocking and threatening approaches, as well as these shaming approaches, is they're not particularly effective for the women who might most need help in overcoming, in quitting using substances or overcoming addiction. And just to give you an idea of how in your face this particular campaign is, this is a shot in Toronto of the ad on all the grocery carts. And I just wanted to point out that this is within a context in our society where mothers are really under the microscope and they can be really heavily criticized. We have a very motherhood-obsessed society that's highly moralized. Now, when it comes to the actual evidence, the harms of most substances are ambiguous. The evidence is ambiguous, especially lower levels of use. And some of the street drugs or illicit drugs actually may not have any long-term effects at all, other than infants being born with withdrawal. And as I mentioned, poverty plays a huge role. And this is a quote from Helen Hurt, a neonatologist in the States, who said that poverty is a more powerful influence on the outcome of children, infants, than gestational exposure to cocaine. So this particular quote comes out of the so-called crack baby epidemic that was on the news in the 90s, and it's really more complicated than that. This is a picture of Jimmy Choo founder Tamara Milan, and she, in an article in the New York Times, talked about how she hired a full-time sobriety coach to help her, and she's a mother, to help her overcome addiction. And this was lovely for her, and in the article, other celebrities talked about doing the same thing. Most of them were anonymous. And another comment is that they were able to remain anonymous even to their spouses in some of these cases. So that's quite a luxury compared to, this is a woman named Mallory, and she was the first person in East Tennessee to be jailed for substance use during pregnancy. She was addicted to crystal meth. And I'm sure if she was able to hire a full-time sobriety coach, she wouldn't have been imprisoned. So what I've outlined is that punitive approach to substance use during pregnancy, where individuals are blamed regardless of the wider circumstances or a socioeconomic situation that may be influencing the health of themselves and their children. But there is another approach that's more holistic. It's the philosophy is more harm reduction centered and really looks at increasing the well-being of the woman, of the mother within the family system, and seeing that infant health and mother health are one instead of in conflict. There are a few programs that embrace a more women-centered philosophy in Canada, including a couple in BC. And HerWay Home is a brand new initiative that started here in Victoria. This is a clip from the Times Colonist article. There's a picture of Amanda Seymour, who's the coordinator. And HerWay Home started about a year ago and is a really trauma-informed, women-centered approach to caring for women whose lives are affected by substance use or violence. And part of the design is to be a one-stop shop and to embrace all the values I talked about, the housing first values that all the programs I showed on the previous slide really recognize the importance of a home in overcoming addictions, and allowing a non-judgmental environment is really important, and women identify that again and again. HerWay Home came together with the help of lots of different community partners, some of whom have changed their logos in the last year, so I've updated this slide. Now, the question that I focus on in this analysis was how potential HerWay Home clients, because the interviews that I analyzed were done before HerWay Home's doors opened, how they define problematic substance use. So what is a problem in terms of substance use during pregnancy and early parenting? And the research team I worked with already conducted and published a study that looked specifically on service providers' perspectives. And in that study, they found that even though maybe in their workplace they would embrace a woman-centered philosophy, personally they would view the infant outcome as being the most important, and sometimes would even talk about a more mother-centered approach as being a means to an end. So there really was this reproduction of a fetal vessel paradigm of pregnancy, and fundamentally the view that substance use of any kind is unacceptable during pregnancy. So knowing that, it becomes especially important to know what the client's perspectives are around substance use during this time. So there were 5 different researchers who conducted, in the end it was 34 in-person interviews. And the average interview length was about 2 hours, and that included quite a number of closed-ended questions which include questions on demographics as well as some standardized questionnaires, depression scales, as well as very specific questions about substance use or history with the child welfare system. And the rest of the interview consisted of more open-ended questions that asked about their definition of problematic substance use, but also about their interactions with different services and what they would contribute to the vision of HerWay Home. So most of the answers on the definition of problematic substance use question I drew from when that was specifically asked, but there were also some codes that I got from other areas of the interview that still informed the answer to that same question. This is a copy of the poster that we used to recruit, and I just wanted to point out that all the participants were 19 years of age or older. We had mostly women in this study, a few men, and the average age was 29 years. Half of the participants in this study identified as Aboriginal, and all of them were very low income. More than 2/3 were receiving income assistance, and only 3 of them had some sort of employment. In this group, 85% were already parents, and of the ones who already had children, about half had children that were not in their own care, so either staying with other family members, maybe grandparents, or their children or child was in a foster home. And a quarter of these participants also rated their housing as insecure or very insecure, and 5 of them were without housing. So remember, these, in order to qualify for this study, they had a child, were expecting or had a child in the last 12 months, and 5 of them were homeless. So it really paints a picture of just how disadvantaged this population is in their socioeconomic status. And yet, when it came to answering the question of how to define problematic substance use, there was not a big challenge of the larger circumstances. There really were 2 competing discourses, and both of them had quite an individualistic theme. And those 2 competing discourses were the ideal of abstinence versus the autonomy of the individual to judge for themselves. And a very typical response would be something like what this mom said here, that it depends, my definition of problematic depends on the substance and how much is being used, but obviously abstinence is the ideal. So to go into to characterize those 2 discourses a little better, abstinence again was the obvious, it was normative, which meant it was in line with what the general opinion is out there, and it was deontological or absolutist, which means that substance use in this time was seen as inherently wrong as an action on its own rather than something embedded and perhaps wrong because of the consequences. Instead, it was wrong in and of itself regardless of the larger context. Whereas the autonomy discourse reflected a more complex understanding of what made something problematic, more nuanced and more naturalistic, so the sense of what was a problem or not was arising from circumstances. While the abstinence discourse had quite a heavy moral conviction in it, there were also some participants who described their own past trauma, which led them to believe that abstinence was the only way to go. And also participants would talk about how abstinence was enforced by ministry policies and legal structures. On the other side, the autonomy discourse talked a lot about relative harms, as the one quote said, depending on what the substance was and how often it was used. There was more anecdotal evidence, and there was a real acknowledgement of the ambiguity in the scientific literature about what the harms of different substances actually could be. Going in a little more to the abstinence themes with some quotes. This mom talking about how it was wrong to use, regardless of whether or not 1 or 2 uses was hurtful, and talking about cocaine. And this is a partner who talked about her own trauma, being brought up in a family where her parents were alcoholic. And she also asked her partner to completely abstain on alcohol and said she was working on the marijuana too. And this partner reinforcing the importance of child welfare in determining what's problematic. Some quotes representing the autonomy discourse, and you'll notice I just have a couple quotes here and they're longer, reflecting the complexity of the autonomy discourse. That sure, a parent can have a glass of wine at the end of the night or smoke a joint. This participant didn't agree with that in particular, but respected that another parent is able to make their own decisions. And this is a mom who went into quite a lot of detail about the ambiguity around alcohol at low levels of drinking. It's, of course, quite established that binge drinking can be very harmful, but having a drink or two a week, standard drink, has not come out in the literature necessarily as being something that is harmful. So there's some confusion around that. Interestingly, the abstinence sub-themes, as I said, or alluded to, they really describe what makes a good mother or bad mother. And it's really a neoliberal representation of an individual's choice both to use substances and to be pregnant. So the onus is really on the individual in this discourse. And harm reduction is seen as only the least a mother can do. So it's not enough to vindicate her or put her morally in the right. Other themes that came out of this abstinence discourse was just how hard the stigmatization and shame and guilt of substance use were to shake. So some quotes representing those first few themes, talking about that woman who loses her kids to drugs. And this second quote comes from a mom whose children were in care. And she spoke even regardless of the abuses she suffered or her socioeconomic conditions, seeing that it was really her own doing. And she really took responsibility for her substance use. And this is quite common. And here's another mom saying, it's selfish to use. And if you want to be a mom and a good mom, you're going to do what you're going to do. You have to do what you have to do. Now, while mothers really put themselves on the receiving end of this moralistic abstinence discourse, seeing themselves as bad mothers, sometimes that stigmatization was really hard to shake. And you see it in these quotes, this mother who feels so overwhelmingly guilty and fighting hard to prove to herself and everyone else that she's not the mother she's made out to be. And this mom really objected to the degree of stigmatization that was placed on her, feeling that she really acknowledged her substance use as self-medication for trauma, and pointed out that just being pregnant doesn't change what is happening. And it's not fair to expect that a mother suddenly gets a load of agency or is able to make big decisions when she was already stuck. And this was another mother who felt that she had jumped through the hoops and she had received her kids back into her own custody. And yet if something came up or somebody looked at her record, she, despite all her great work, she would be viewed as a bad mother from the past. In the autonomy discourse, and I just want to clarify, there was no parent in this study that advocated for substance use. Most people, everyone placed it within some kind of harm spectrum, but it was really common for participants to describe the harms of substance related to the substance type and frequency of use, which is really interesting because back at the provider analysis, where we asked service providers, they didn't often go into the details of which types of substances were harmful and how much was harmful. That largely any substance use at all was seen as a breach of maternal care. Harms were mediated by the social determinants of health. So I'll get more into that when we look at the quotes. There's a more holistic view of health. Definitely mother and infant health were seen as something together, but there was still an emphasis on the individual in this discourse. And finally, disruption of the family was seen as a problem in itself. So separating kids from their parents, for example, was a problem that had its own harms independent from any perceived substance use. So some quotes that reflect those themes. This mother specifying that it was a problem when you're addicted, and that would come up often, being dependent on harmful drugs. So implying that not all drugs are harmful. And here she describes when you're addicted and not taking care of yourself, not eating, not drinking, that hurts you as a mother and also your baby at the same time. This is a mother who talked about the overall environment of someone who was struggling with substance use, how it's not healthy overall. And this is my first quote in this presentation coming from a dad who commented that the amount of money you spend on your child amount of money you spend on substances may take away from your ability to take care of your child. Though I'll note that nobody came up and said, well, if I could hire a full-time nanny and a full-time sobriety coach, it wouldn't be a problem. Now going into a few more emotional and even spiritual themes. This particular mom, talking about the disruption of the family, really viewed that the reportedly low amount of marijuana that she used during her pregnancy was not as harmful for her children as being moved from foster home to foster home. And this is a dad who talked about the problem of being alcoholic as not being able to make a true home. He talked about even if you have a roof over your head, being alcoholic doesn't allow a family to be whole. And this mother, when she was asked, what is your definition of substance use? She went straight to this answer, which is that it's problematic when I feel hopeless. When I feel hopeless, I feel like turning to substances, or feeling like substance is the only way to go. Which, for me, really highlighted how problematic cannot be viewed in just biomedical terms, and not only in that dominant moralistic discourse. I'm going to go back to Tamara Milan from Jimmy's Shoes, because in that New York Times article, she had a great quote that I think actually summarizes this pretty well. She says it's not the actual substance that defines addiction, it's the feelings underneath. And it's amazing the ability to move on once you are healthy and not stuck in the past. And certainly programs like HerWay Home aim to bring mothers to that space of being healthy and moving on. This is an ad from Young Women United in the States. And this is the kind of depiction that I would like to see of mothers with addictions. And not so much this one that suggests that they're irresponsible or don't love their children. In summary, participants really did take on individual and moral responsibility for their substance use, which was largely seen to be harmful, although in the autonomy discourse relative to context and the amount of use, etc. There were no discussion about the protective factors, such as nutrition, that can actually help buffer the effects of substances on fetuses. And I think it's really important for service providers to realize that both that autonomy discourse and that moral discourse occur simultaneously in the same individual. So mothers and fathers are both grappling with both their moral understanding as well as that more nuanced understanding of what is harmful and what is problematic. And I'd like to make a general call for more evidence-based discussions of harms and resilience for mothers and infants together, especially when affected by low socioeconomic status, which really dovetails with the effects of substances. So after the provider's paper has been published, and there was also a paper that our research team published about the different factors for evaluating programs like HerWay Home. This one that I presented is in submission, and the next step will really be to do a gendered analysis of these findings. So as I said, there were only 8 dads in this study, but the conversation about dads was really rich, and I'm really happy to present that in a separate study. This was the last slide of my presentation. It's a collage made by a client of HerWay Home, showing what HerWay Home meant to her. And I have, if you want to keep listening for just a few minutes, I have a few slides on better advertising, discouraging women from drinking during pregnancy. And those are my bonus slides. So hang on if you want to see them. These are drawn from Nancy Poole's Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Prevention blog. And this one is just great. There's no judgment, and really encourages women to seek information. Here's another one. It's a very non-offensive image and quite lovely, showing an empty glass. I like this one because it emphasizes the social support for women to make choices during pregnancy, healthy choices. And this is just from the top of a great little fact sheet about how men can help women have an alcohol-free pregnancy. And of course, this is still under the rhetoric that no alcohol is safest, rather than perhaps a more nuanced discussion, which would help us look at really the bigger picture of what influences infant outcomes and families, and especially to look at the effects of poverty and marginalization and the breaking up of families as being sometimes just as problematic or more problematic than substance use during pregnancy.